Look at the wealthiest Indian business families of the 20th century. The Birlas, the Bahars, the Goenkas, the Ruiyas, the Singhanias, the Podars, the Dalmias, the Jindals, the Junjunwalas, and the man who built ArcelorMittal, Lakshmi Mittal. What if I told you that almost all of them came from the same tiny region of India? Not a state, not even a city. A single dry, marginal stretch of desert country in northern Rajasthan, smaller than most American counties. And what if I told you that this same community, which most of the world has never heard of, still controls a disproportionate share of Indian industry, finance, and trade today, even though they make up well under 1% of India's population? This is not a coincidence. It is the result of one of the most remarkable business stories on Earth, built over roughly 400 years by a community most outsiders cannot even name. They are called the Marwaris. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how a community from a desert that should have produced nothing managed to take over a huge swath of the business of an entire subcontinent, and what they did that almost nobody else has ever copied. Before we start, if you are new here, this channel digs into how Asian communities built fortunes that the mainstream world never talks about. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. It genuinely helps the channel grow. To understand the Marwaris, you have to start with the land they came from. And here's the first thing that almost everyone gets wrong. The name Marwari sounds like it should mean from Marwar, the region around Jodhpur in southwestern Rajasthan. And historically, that's where the term came from. But the families on that list at the top, the Birlas, the Bajaj, the Singhanias, the Podars, almost all of them, are not actually from Marwar. They are from a smaller, drier stretch of country to the northeast called Shekhawati, in the districts of Junjunu, Sikar, and Churu. The town of Pilani, where the Birlas come from, sits in Shekhawati. So does Singhana, where the Singhanias come from. So does Sadulpur, where Lakshmi Mittal was born. Over time, the label Marwari got stretched to cover all the trading communities that came out of this broader belt, even though the leading business families are mostly Shekhawatis. So when you hear Marwari in the rest of this video, that's the community we're really talking about. A handful of merchant subcastes, Agarwals, Maheshwaris, Oswals, Khandalwals, are concentrated in a stretch of semi-desert in northern Rajasthan. The land itself is brutal. Poor soil, unreliable rainfall. Agriculture barely worked. For most of recorded history, this region produced just enough food to keep its people alive, and not always that. A region like this should have produced nothing of importance. By every rule of geography and economics, it should have stayed poor and obscure forever. But the very thing that should have buried this community is what made them rich. Because the land could not feed them, the people of this region had to leave. And because they had to leave, they became something else. They became traders. Starting around the 17th century, families began moving along the caravan routes of northern India. They settled in trading hubs, set up shops, and started moving goods between regions. By the late 1600s and the early 1700s, when the Mughal Empire was beginning to fracture, traders from this community were already embedded in the financial life of much of northern and eastern India. The most famous early example was the Jagat Seth family, originally from Nagaur in Rajasthan. They migrated to Bengal in 1652, and within a few generations became financiers to the Mughal Nawabs of Bengal, and at one point it was the largest indigenous banking house in the country. This is the first lesson of the Marwari story, and it is an uncomfortable one. The disadvantage that should have destroyed them became the engine that made them rich. Most people spend their lives trying to make their disadvantages go away. The Marwaris turned theirs into the entire foundation of their wealth. They could not farm, so they had to trade. They had to trade, so they got good at it. And being good at trade, in a country where most people stayed on their land for generations, became one of the rarest and most valuable skills in the entire economy. But here's the part that makes the Marwari story different from every other migrating trader community in history. They didn't just leave. They left as a network. When a Marwari family moved to a new city, they didn't move alone. They moved into the homes of other Marwari families already there. The new arrival would work for an established trader, often for years, learning the business. He would sleep in the back of the shop. He would eat with the family. He would handle increasingly important transactions. And eventually, when he was ready, the established trader would help him start his own business in a different city, sometimes with capital, sometimes with credit, sometimes just with introductions to the right suppliers and customers. This system had names. The young trader in training, working as an in-house accountant or bookkeeper, was called a Mun EM. A trusted agent sent out to run a branch firm in another city was called a Gumasta. The senior trader who hosted and trained him was responsible for his moral conduct, his business education, and his eventual launch. The relationship lasted decades. Often, the young man's first independent business would still rely on credit and supply from his mentor for years. What this produced was something almost no other business community in history has ever built. A self-replicating training and capital system that scaled across an entire subcontinent without needing modern institutions. There were no Marwari business schools. There was no Marwari central bank. The whole thing ran on family, community apprenticeship, and trade guild-style Mahajan associations, quasi-formal community bodies that handled disputes and enforced standards. This is the second lesson. The Marwaris understood something that modern business has nearly forgotten. People are taught, not hired. The cheapest, fastest, most loyal employee is the one you raised inside your business from the time he was a teenager. Every Marwari trader spent decades training the next generation, and the next generation paid that investment forward by training the one after. The result was a community where business knowledge compounded across generations the same way money does. Then came the third piece of the puzzle, and this one needs a careful framing because it gets misrepresented constantly. The Marwaris did not invent indigenous banking in India. They did not have to. India already had a sophisticated system of credit instruments called hundis, handwritten bills of exchange that go back at least to the 12th century, with even earlier precursors in the ancient Mauryan economy. Hundis were used by Gujarati Shroffs, by Multanis, by South Indian Chettiars, and by many other communities besides the Marwaris. What the Marwaris did is take that pre-existing system and build the largest, densest, most disciplined hundi network in the subcontinent. A merchant in Calcutta could write a hundi for 1,000 rupees, hand it to a traveling agent, and that agent could carry the paper to Bombay, present it to a Marwari trader, and receive the cash. The Bombay trader would then settle the account with the Calcutta trader at some later date, often by netting it out against other transactions flowing in the opposite direction. This sounds simple. It is not. To make this system work, you need an enormous amount of trust. You need the Bombay trader to believe the Calcutta trader will eventually settle. You need a way to identify forged hundis. You need a system of accounting that lets distant traders reconcile thousands of transactions without losing track. You need a way to punish anyone who breaks the rules, because once trust collapses, the whole system collapses. The Marwaris built all of that. They developed community courts that handled disputes inside the community without involving outside authorities. They developed a reputation system where a merchant who cheated would never be lent to again, anywhere in the network, by anyone. And later, in the early 20th century, families like the Birlas refined an accounting discipline known as the Partha system, a daily reckoning of margins, costs, and profitability that gave a merchant a real-time view of his business in a way that even today's ERP software struggles to match. What this all produced, taken together, was the equivalent of a private financial system, run by a community of a few 100,000 people operating across an entire subcontinent. Capital flowed through these networks faster and more cheaply than through any formal bank for centuries. This is the third lesson. The Marwaris did not wait for banks. They built the best private credit network in the country on top of an instrument anyone could have used, but no one used as well. Whoever can move capital faster and more cheaply than the formal system around them has an advantage that nobody on the outside can see and nobody on the inside has to pay for. The Marwaris had that advantage for centuries before anyone else even knew to look for it. Quick pause. If you are learning something from this story, hit subscribe right now. The Marwari Playbook is one of the most studied business systems in Indian business schools and one of the least known outside of India. More videos like this are coming, breaking down how other Asian communities built equally hidden wealth. Subscribe so you see them. By the time the British East India Company was consolidating power in India in the 1700s, the Marwaris were already a dominant indigenous trading network in northern and eastern India. The relationship between the community and the British is more complicated than the usual telling. Marwaris worked with the British commercially. They also later helped fund the movement that pushed the British out. Both things are true. When the British set up their colonial trading operations in Calcutta, they needed local intermediaries, people who could buy from Indian producers, organize shipments, manage warehouses, and finance transactions in rupees while the British dealt in pounds sterling. The Marwaris stepped into that role and excelled at it. By the late 1800s, Calcutta was one of the wealthiest cities in Asia, and a large share of the wealth flowing through it was passing through Marwari hands as commissions, financing fees, and trading profits. The community amassed enormous capital during the British era, primarily in commodities, jute, opium, cotton, and the textile import and export business. They were not the owners of the British firms. They were the indispensable middlemen that made those firms work. And then, at the turn of the 20th century, something shifted. As Indian nationalism grew, and as Indians began to be allowed to compete with British firms in industry, the Marwaris had something nobody else in India had at the same scale. Enormous pools of liquid capital, decades of business experience, and a network of trust that could fund massive new ventures without needing to ask any British bank for permission. The Birla family is the clearest example. Starting from a small trading firm in Pilani, the Birlas built a textile business, then cement, then an industrial conglomerate spanning everything from cars to aluminum. They also became major financiers of the Indian independence movement. Jamnalal Bajaj and G.D. Birla both personally bankrolled Gandhi and the Congress. By the mid-20th century, the Birlas were one of the largest business families in Asia. They did it on Marwari capital with Marwari partners, using Marwari trust networks to move money and people across the country. The Bajaj family built a similar empire across automobiles, cement, and finance, eventually becoming famous for the Bajaj Chatak scooter in the 1970s. The Goenkas spread across multiple industries. The Singhanias built JK Group and Raymond, one of the largest textile groups in India. The Ruiyas built SR across steel, oil, shipping, and power. The Jindals built a steel empire that today is one of the largest in the country. And Lakshmi Mittal, born in Sadolpur and Shekhawati, eventually built ArcelorMittal into one of the largest steel companies in the entire world. Every single one of those stories starts in a Marwari trading firm somewhere in the late 1800s or the early 1900s. Every single one of them ran on the same playbook. Trade first, accumulate capital, build a network of trust, then deploy that capital into industry when the moment is right. This brings us to the fourth lesson. The Marwaris didn't get rich from one good idea. They got rich from being ready when an opportunity finally appeared. By the time British India was opening up to Indian industrial competition, this community had been preparing for 2.5 centuries. They had the capital, the experience, the networks, and the discipline. When the door opened, they walked through it before anyone else had even noticed it was a door. Most people spend their lives waiting for the right opportunity. The Marwaris spent their lives building the ability to take any opportunity. Those are completely different strategies, and they produce completely different outcomes. And here's the fifth lesson, which is also where the story gets more honest than most tellings of it. The Marwaris are still a major force in Indian business in 2026, but they are no longer the dominant force the way they were in 1960. The single richest man in India today, Mukesh Ambani of Reliance, is Gujarati. The second richest, Gautam Adani, is also Gujarati. Several of the largest fortunes in the country today belong to Gujaratis, Parsis, South Indians, and others. After India liberalized in 1991, the Marwari share of the economy shrank as new sectors opened up, and other communities, especially Gujaratis in energy and infrastructure, and South Indians in IT, moved aggressively into them. But look at the Forbes India list, and the Marwari presence is still massively disproportionate to their share of the population. The Bajajs, the Birlas, the Jindals, Radhakishan-Damani, the Goenkas, the Ruiyas. They are still there, generation after generation. From less than 1% of the population, the community still occupies several of the top 10 spots and a meaningful share of the top 100. The late stock investor Rakesh Jhunjhunwala was Marwari. So are a large share of the wealthiest stock market traders in India today. The mechanism keeps working because the community keeps maintaining it. Marriages still happen largely within the community. Capital still flows through trust networks. Young Marwaris are still trained in family businesses from an early age. The discipline still holds. So when you look at modern Indian business and you wonder why a tiny sliver of the population, traceable to a dry stretch of desert in northern Rajasthan, ended up so disproportionately represented at the top of an entire country's economy, the answer isn't luck. It isn't even one strategy. It is 5 things, working together for 4 centuries. They turned their geographic disadvantage into a forced advantage by becoming traders. They built a self-replicating training system so business knowledge compounded across generations. They mastered an indigenous credit system more thoroughly than anyone else in the country had, so they did not need to wait for outside capital. They positioned themselves as the indispensable middle layer of every economic system they entered, accumulating capital that other people produced. And when the moment came to move from trading into industry, they had 3 centuries of preparation behind them, and almost nobody else did. The Marwari story is the clearest example I know of what compounding actually looks like when you let it run for long enough. Not money compounding. Capability, capital, trust, and community all compounding together across centuries, inside a network that protects its own. You do not have to be Marwari to learn from this, but you do have to understand what they understood. Build your training inside your network instead of buying it. Move capital through trust instead of through institutions when you can. Position yourself as the indispensable middle of any system you can find. And when an opportunity finally arrives, be the one who is already ready for it. The Marwaris were not the smartest community in India. They were not the largest. They did not come from the wealthiest land. They just played a longer game than almost anyone else in the world, and they played it together. That was enough to turn a desert into one of the most successful business communities in modern history. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end. The next video on your screen pulls back the curtain on another Asian community that built one of the strangest takeovers in modern business history. Click it, keep learning, and I will see you in the next one.